Today's mindful moment. We hear a lot these days about the strides we've made in education since the civil rights era. But is it possible that for millions of students, things are still separate and unequal? That's what we're going to be looking at today in our deep dive into Jonathan Kozol's book, The Shame of the Nation. And we're going to uncover some pretty shocking truths about segregation and how it's still happening in schools, even in the 21st century.
I think one of the things that's so powerful about Kozol's book is that he really immerses himself in these schools. I mean, he doesn't just sort of throw statistics at us. He
Right.
goes into classrooms, he talks to students, he talks to teachers, and really gives a voice to those who are often unheard.
Yeah. It's like investigative journalism in a way.
Yeah.
It's like going behind the scenes and finding out what's really happening. And one of the most, I think, startling things that he reveals is just the extent of resegregation that's happening in our schools.
Absolutely. And the data from the Civil Rights Project at Harvard really backs this up. They found that nearly 3/4 of Black and Latino students attend predominantly minority schools. And
Yes.
even more alarming is that over 2 million students are actually in what Kozol calls apartheid schools. These are schools that are 99 to 100% non-white.
Wow. Yeah, and these aren't just numbers, right? Kozol actually brings this to life through the stories that he tells.
Yes, and some of them are really hard to hear. Like, he tells the story of this one little girl who by fourth grade was reading at a second grade level, and she had not had a permanent teacher since kindergarten.
Oh my God.
And, her silence spoke volumes about the kind of injustice that was happening.
That's heartbreaking. And it really makes you question how this can still be happening in the 21st century, especially when you see just the stark difference in resources between schools.
Yes, the disparity is just astounding. And Kozol really highlights this by comparing, per pupil spending in districts like Manhasset, New York, where they're spending over $17,000 per student, with under-resourced districts in the Bronx where spending can be, less than half of that.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like we're setting these students up for failure from the start in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But Kozol digs even deeper, right? And he reveals something even more troubling than just the resource disparity.
Right.
And he calls this the ordering regime.
Yeah, this is where things start to get really disturbing because he observed this really strict scripted curriculum that was being used mostly in schools that were serving Black and Hispanic students. So you have these classrooms where children are being taught using silent signals and predetermined responses, and there's really no room for creativity or individual expression.
It's dehumanizing in a way.
It's dehumanizing.
And Kozol really makes a point of saying that this is something that you very rarely, if ever, see in schools that are predominantly white and affluent.
Right.
So what is the purpose of this kind of system?
Well, that's the question that Kozol really grapples with. And he argues that many of these inner city schools are essentially funneling their students towards low-wage jobs rather than equipping them for college or really allowing them to reach their full potential.
Right.
And he talks about schools that have these very specific career tracks, like a medical careers track, which sounds good, but it really limits what students can do later on.
Right. It reminds me of that anecdote he shared about the culinary arts program in that Chicago high school.
Yeah.
And the teacher was actually concerned that these programs were kind of trapping students in these low-paying jobs, even when they had demonstrated that they had the potential to go on to college.
Right.
So it's almost like we're perpetuating a cycle of poverty and inequality.
Yeah, it's exactly his.
Through the education system.
Yeah, and he's really pushing us to think beyond, these surface level solutions and look at these deeper systemic issues.
Well, and speaking of perpetuating systems, let's talk about standardized testing.
Okay.
This is something that we hear a lot about being touted as the great equalizer.
Right.
But is that really the case?
Well, Kozol's findings suggest otherwise. He found that in many of these under-resourced schools, the pressure to raise test scores was leading to this laser focus on test preparation, and it was often at the expense of a well-rounded education.
Right. So instead of actually, learning and expanding their horizons, it's just teaching to the test, basically.
Exactly. And he describes these practices like front-loading, where they're literally drilling kindergartners on test-taking skills
Oh, my goodness.
before they've even had a chance to really experience the joy of learning. And he shares the story of this principal, Aida Rosa, who was actually penalized for taking in low-performing students because their scores didn't immediately improve.
Wow.
Which just shows you how flawed that logic is.
It's like we're punishing the people who are trying to make a difference. But Kozol doesn't just focus on the problems, right? He also kind of delves into the history of all these well-intentioned but ultimately failed attempts at reform.
Yeah. And he talks about programs like Higher Horizons back in the 1960s, which were, well-intentioned, but ultimately unsuccessful because they didn't really tackle the root cause of segregation.
Right.
They were trying to make up for the inequality without actually dismantling the system that created it.
Yeah, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Exactly.
We're addressing the symptoms without actually dealing with the underlying disease.
Mm.
And Kozol argues that this is a pattern that repeats itself.
Yeah.
Every few years we get these promises of revolutionary changes.
Yeah.
It's often just kind of repackaging old ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And the core issue of segregation is kind of swept under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like we're afraid to have this honest conversation about race and class in America, and how these forces intersect and perpetuate this cycle of inequality in our education system.
Absolutely. And that's why I think Kozol's work is so important, because he doesn't shy away from those difficult conversations.
Right.
And he really calls for this renewed civil rights movement that's focused on educational justice. And he highlights the power of individuals to actually make a difference. Like, he tells the story of David Engel, this principal in Seattle, who resigned in protest after this desegregation program was dismantled. So, it's a really powerful example of taking a stand against injustice.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see that there are individuals who are challenging the status quo. But what about the systemic changes that are needed to really dismantle this segregated system?
Right.
That's something that we need to delve into a little bit further.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that's so important about Kozol's work is that he doesn't just leave us feeling hopeless. He doesn't just sort of present this bleak picture and say, that's it.
Yeah.
He actually offers some concrete solutions and really celebrates those individuals who are fighting for change within the system.
Yeah, he doesn't just point fingers. He actually lights a path forward.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the solutions that he proposes?
Well, one of the things he really emphasizes is the need to get rid of these rigid, scripted curricula, particularly in under-resourced schools. He really wants teachers to reclaim their autonomy, to tap into their passion and their expertise and really create learning environments that foster, critical thinking and a genuine love for learning.
It's about empowering teachers to actually be educators, not just facilitators of some standardized script.
Right, exactly. And he gives examples of teachers who are resisting this one-size-fits-all approach.
Yep.
Teachers who refuse to, sanitize student writing to fit some, predetermined mold teachers who, sneak in real literature, who risk their jobs to make learning meaningful and engaging. These are the unsung heroes of the education system.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see that even within this system that can feel so restrictive,
yeah,
there are those who are daring to break the mold.
Absolutely. And, Kozol also reminds us that change doesn't stop at the classroom door. We have to address the social and economic inequalities that fuel these educational disparities.
Right.
We're talking poverty, housing discrimination, lack of access to healthcare. All of these things play a role.
We can't just fix the schools in isolation without addressing the broader societal issues that are impacting a child's ability to actually learn and thrive.
Exactly. And Kozol doesn't shy away from these conversations about race and class.
Right.
He really advocates for kind of a revival of the civil rights movement spirit, but this time focused on educational justice. And he calls for, parents, teachers, students, community members to mobilize and demand change.
So he's talking about, sit-ins, protests, taking it to the streets, making some noise, to really force those in power to pay attention.
Yeah, he believes we may need to disrupt the status quo in order to be heard.
Right.
But it's not just about demanding more money for schools. He actually argues for kind of a systemic overhaul.
So what would that look like?
Well, he advocates for challenging the way that schools are funded, pushing for more equitable distribution of resources. He supports policies that promote integration and diversity.
Right.
And he's very critical of this over-reliance on these high-stakes standardized tests.
Right, which he sees as actually being detrimental to students, especially those in under-resourced schools.
Exactly. He argues that these tests have narrowed the curriculum, they've created this culture of anxiety, and they've actually widened the achievement gap. They measure a very narrow band of skills and ignore, the multifaceted nature of intelligence and potential.
Right. But what about those who say that integration is just too difficult, too expensive, or even undesirable.
Yeah.
What does Kozol say to them?
Well, he challenges the notion that separate can ever be truly equal.
Right.
And he points to successful integration programs that are already happening, like in Louisville, Kentucky, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And he argues that we have a moral obligation to create a just and equitable education system for all children, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, or their zip code.
Right. It's a powerful call to action. But what can individuals do? What can our listeners do to actually contribute to this fight for educational justice?
Well, Kozol offers a lot of suggestions. Get involved in your local schools, support organizations that are fighting for equity, vote for candidates who prioritize education, speak out against injustice whenever you see it.
So it's about, taking action in our own communities, however small it may seem.
Right, exactly. And he emphasizes the importance of, connecting with people from diverse backgrounds, building bridges across lines of difference, working together to create a more inclusive and just society.
Right. We need to step outside our own bubbles and engage with those whose experiences might be very different from our own.
Exactly. And Kozol reminds us that the fight for educational justice isn't just about the children. It's about the kind of society that we want to live in. Do we want to perpetuate a system that reinforces inequality, or do we want to create a system where every child has the opportunity to reach their full potential?
It's a really profound question that I think we all need to grapple with. And Kozol's book, while it highlights this, really bleak reality, also shines a light on those who are working towards a brighter future. He shares these inspiring stories of individuals like Mr. Bedrock, this teacher in the South Bronx.
Yeah, Mr. Bedrock is a great example of the kind of educator that Kozol wants us to celebrate. He's dedicated, he's compassionate, and he refuses to let you know. Standardized testing or bureaucratic constraints extinguish his passion for teaching.
Right. And Kozol describes his classroom as this really warm and nurturing space where students feel safe to take risks, to be curious, to simply be themselves.
Yeah.
And it's such a stark contrast to the test prep factories that he observes in other schools.
Exactly. And Mr. Bedrock's story reminds us that even within a system that can feel so dehumanizing, there are individuals who are striving to uphold the true spirit of education, nurturing the minds and hearts of their students.
Right. And then there's the inspiring story of Aida Rosa, this principal who transformed a failing school in the South Bronx.
Aida Rosa is amazing. She's this force of nature, and Kozol describes her as, this really strong, compassionate leader who refused to let the challenges she faced kind of dim her belief in her students' potential.
Right. And she fought for resources. She challenged the status quo, and she created this culture of high expectations and academic excellence.
Yeah, and the results were remarkable. Test scores improved, attendance went up. The school became this beacon of hope in a community that had been neglected for so long.
But her story also kind of reveals the systemic obstacles that often hinder progress.
Right.
Kozol mentions how she was penalized for taking in low-performing students.
Yeah.
Which really highlights how these accountability measures can sometimes backfire and punish those who are trying to do the right thing.
Right. It reminds us that we need to look beyond, these simplistic metrics and consider the complexities of each situation.
Right.
And we need to support those who are trying to make a difference, not punish them for taking on difficult challenges.
Right. So to kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways from Kozol's work?
Well, I think first and foremost, segregation remains a pervasive problem in American education, and it's actually intensifying. We're seeing a resegregation of schools.
Right.
And secondly, the segregation creates massive disparities in resources and opportunities between schools serving different communities.
Right.
And thirdly, this has led to the development of separate and unequal education systems, one for the privileged and one for the marginalized. And finally, we need to reignite the fight for educational justice. We need to draw inspiration from the civil rights movement and demand a system that serves all children equitably.
Right. It's a sobering message, but I think one that we all need to hear. And I have to say, Kozol's book can be quite disheartening at times.
Yeah.
It really paints a bleak picture of our education system.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, what gives you hope amidst all of this?
Well, you're right. Kozol doesn't sugarcoat the reality, but I think amidst the darkness, there are these glimmers of hope. And for me, it's the people, it's the teachers who are fighting for their students. It's the principals who are challenging the system. It's the parents who are advocating for their children. It's the students themselves who are raising their voices.
Right.
It's knowing that there are individuals out there who are refusing to accept the status quo, who are fighting for a better future, who believe in the transformative power of education. And that's what gives me hope.
That's a powerful reminder that even in the face of these seemingly insurmountable challenges, there's still reason to hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And it's inspiring to see that, despite these huge challenges, these systemic challenges, there are these pockets of hope that emerge from, individuals who are really dedicated to making a difference.
Right.
But what about like broader systemic changes? Does Kozol offer any solutions on that front?
He does. And one of the things he highlights is this growing movement towards smaller schools, which he sees as, a way to kind of foster a sense of community and provide more personalized attention to students.
Yeah.
It's about creating environments where each child feels seen and heard and supported.
Yeah. It really does take a village, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Building that sense of community within a school, I think can be so transformative for both students and teachers.
Absolutely. And he also points to organizations like the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, which is advocating for more equitable school funding.
Right.
And he really sees legal action as a powerful tool to hold states accountable for providing a quality education to all children, regardless of their background.
Yeah, it's about, making sure that resources are distributed fairly and that every child has access to the same opportunities.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the need to challenge the dominant narratives around education.
Right.
Those that focus solely on individual achievement while ignoring the systemic factors that contribute to inequality.
Right.
So we need to kind of dismantle those myths and really engage in these honest conversations about race and class and power dynamics within our education system.
Yeah, we need to kind of question those deeply ingrained assumptions and shift the narrative to one that acknowledges those systemic barriers that so many students face.
Exactly. And Kozol reminds us that this fight isn't about abstract principles.
Right.
It's about the lives of real children.
Right.
Children like Pineapple, who is struggling to learn in an overcrowded classroom, or children like Anthony, whose creativity and curiosity are being stifled by, a rigid standardized curriculum, or children like Mireya, who worries about, basic necessities like having toilet paper in the school bathroom.
Wow.
These are the faces of inequality. These are the children whose futures are being shaped by the choices we make as a society.
Yeah, and I think Kozol's work is so powerful because he really humanizes these issues. He forces us to confront the real world consequences of inaction.
Right. And he reminds us that silence is complicity. We cannot simply stand by and watch as this injustice unfolds.
Right.
We have a moral imperative to speak out, to demand better for our children, to fight for a more equitable and just society for all.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
What can our listeners do to kind of contribute to this movement for educational justice?
Well, there are so many ways to make a difference. You can volunteer at a local school. You can tutor a child. You can donate to organizations that are working towards educational equity. Or you can simply, engage in conversations about these issues with your friends and family.
Right.
You can contact your elected officials, advocate for policies that prioritize education.
Right.
So it's really about, recognizing that even small actions can have a ripple effect and create momentum for change.
Absolutely.
And remember, change rarely happens overnight.
Right.
It requires sustained effort, commitment, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. And I think Kozol's work serves as a really powerful reminder that this fight is worth having.
Because the stakes are so high. We're not just talking about test scores or graduation rates.
Right.
We're talking about the future of our children.
Right.
The health of our communities, the very fabric of our democracy.
Yeah, it's about creating a society where every child, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to thrive.
That's the dream. And I think Kozol's book really challenges us to turn that dream into a reality.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Jonathan Kozol's The Shame of the Nation.
Yeah.
It's a challenging read, but it's an essential one, and we encourage all of our listeners to pick up a copy.
Absolutely.
And really explore these issues further.
Yeah, the children are waiting.
And they're counting on us to fight for their future. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more thought-provoking discussions, and share this episode with anyone who needs to hear this message.
Yes, please do.
Together, we can make a difference. There's a link to buy the book in the episode description. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share it with anyone who loves exploring ideas. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic. Until then, keep those minds curious and engaged.